Yes, Mr. Keating.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Could I call Michael Adamson, please?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Adamson.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I gather you're going to affirm.
I am indeed, yes.
Well, the words should be there on the screen in front of you. Would you read them out, please?
Of course. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down, make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Keating, when you're ready.
Mr. Adamson, thank you so much for attending today and assisting the inquiry with its investigations. Just a few words by way of introduction, which we say to all witnesses. Firstly, could I invite you to keep your voice up as loud as you can, so that the transcriber can capture what you have to say. It also helps not to nod or shake your head, but to say yes or no. And if any of my questions are unclear, please just say so, and I'm sure it's my fault, and I can rephrase those. We will take a break probably this afternoon, mid-afternoon, but if you need a break at any stage, just please let us know. I'm sure we can accommodate that. In terms of formalities, could we just deal with your statement, please, which you provided to inquiry, and that's dated the 15th of July. It's BRC, and it is 6075. So we can see there your statement, the front page, dated the 15th of July, as we said, 2019. If you could turn to page 36, please. And we see your name in print, and can you confirm that's your signature?
Yes, it is.
And are those, the contents of that statement, true to the best of your belief and knowledge?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. And have you had the opportunity to read your statements recently?
I have, yes, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Just to assist you and to assist the panel where your evidence is going to cover, it's going to fall into three areas. Firstly, your dealings with Nicholas Holgate on the 15th of June. And secondly, your involvement with the London Gold Response, also known as the Grenfell Fire Response Team, and that occurred over the weekend onwards, so that would be the 17th of June onwards. And thirdly, we're going to look forward and capture some of the lessons you consider the British Red Cross have learned from the incident, and also the work that's been undertaken in the field, especially by the British Red Cross in relation to the role of the voluntary sector. Is that okay?
That sounds fine.
Okay, so that's our pathway. And before we do that, it just briefly matters by way of background and your position. Since 2014, is it right that you've held a position as Chief Executive of the British Red Cross?
That is correct.
And it's also correct, isn't it, that you are a trustee of the Disasters Emergency Committee, which brings together 14 leading UK agencies whose function is to raise money at times of humanitarian crises overseas.
Yes, I am.
And since the Grenfell Tower fire, you've been appointed a trustee of the National Emergencies Trust, which was set up in late 2019 to collaborate with charities and other bodies to raise and distribute money and support at the time of a domestic disaster. Is that correct?
That's no longer the case. I was a trustee until towards the end of last year.
Okay. So you were a trustee, and this entity, the National Emergency Trust, deals with emergencies and fundraising in terms of domestic context. Is that correct?
It is there to assist with the coordination of fundraising.
And in relation to the British Red Cross, you've helpfully set out in your statement at paragraph 22, which we don't need to look at, but the British Red Cross has 4,000 members of staff and is assisted by over 18,000 volunteers in its humanitarian work. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perhaps we could look at paragraph 24 of your statement, please, as we examine the role of the British Red Cross and its, as you describe, its special status. So paragraph 24. The British Red Cross does also have a special status, which means that it neither forms part of government nor comprises a non-government organisation, brackets, which differs from many other charitable bodies active within the voluntary sector, close brackets. This is its auxiliary or support function to the UK public authorities in the humanitarian field. And then it goes on to mention the Charter, which is the British Red Cross Charter. Is that correct, that the British Red Cross is in effect an auxiliary to government?
That is correct, yes.
And the effect of this is perhaps can be seen at the bottom of paragraph 24, and you've written this. This recognition enables an automatic relationship between the British Red Cross and the government, such that the BRC is required to have regard to the considerations of the government without being beholden to it, while carrying out its primary responsibility to alleviate sufferings in emergencies. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So there's a special status, is what you're saying, of the British Red Cross within the voluntary sector.
That's correct. Every Red Cross or Red Crescent organisation in every country in the world, 192 countries, has that auxiliary status with its government. But its job is to support people in emergencies and times of crisis and to alleviate suffering and make good judgments about how to do that.
Yes. And in relation to local authorities, is it correct that the nature of support provided by the British Red Cross during an emergency would be with reference, for example, to the Memorandum of Understanding as agreed between the British Red Cross and that local authority?
That would be typically the arrangement, yes.
And the written evidence from your colleague, Emma Sprague, was that there was a Memorandum of Understanding between RBKC and the British Red Cross back in 2017. It perhaps was out of date, but there was that sort of pre-existing relationship.
That's my understanding, yes.
And we can perhaps deal with this matter now. If there was a Memorandum of Understanding which had lapsed, i.e. was out of date, would that inhibit or interfere with the support the British Red Cross would provide?
Obviously, our aim would be to ensure that memoranda of understanding are up to date, but fundamentally, no. We would respond in partnership with the authorities while endeavouring to ensure that we were meeting need in the best way possible.
Yes. And the effect, as we know, in relation to the Grenfell Tower response is from the 14th of June, the British Red Cross was actively involved in the response. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Now, perhaps we can now turn to the first area which I mentioned, which was the 15th of June contact with Nicholas Holgate. We'll hear later in the module from your colleague, Emma Sprague, who was very much involved in the operational aspects of the British Red Cross response from the 14th of June. And for those reasons, I can focus and touch upon your direct dealings, if that's okay.
Of course.
And we can capture that later on. Perhaps we could go to paragraph 64, please, of your statement. And this is what you've written here. We had decided at the ELT meeting, is that the Executive Leadership Team meeting?
That's correct.
We had decided at the Executive Leadership Team meeting that took place on Thursday the 15th of June that I should proactively get in touch with the then Chief Executive of RBKC, Nicholas Holgate, to obtain an update on the relief effort and to discuss additional ways in which the British Red Cross could potentially provide further assistance with the response. Is that right? Was that the position?
Yes, that's correct.
In terms of providing additional support, is it the position, and it was then, that British Red Cross could offer to provide assistance but couldn't really force upon a local authority its assistance?
Yes, our aim would be, normally in responding to an emergency, we are commissioned by a local authority effectively, but we can also be proactive in making offers to them if we think a broader range of capabilities might be useful.
But it's an offer which requires the acceptance of the local authority?
That would be our preference.
Yes. Well, let's explore that a little bit more in relation to this meeting that you decided on the 15th of June that was necessary for you to proactively get in touch with Nicholas Holgate. Had the British Red Cross, by that stage on the morning of the Thursday the 15th of June, formed a view or had any concerns on how the local authority were leading the provision of emergency relief?
I think by the Thursday morning, the scale and complexity of the emergency was starting to become clearer, both because the death toll was becoming clearer and the number of people being evacuated from the Grenfell Tower and indeed the surrounding streets was becoming clearer, and therefore that this was not a typical emergency. And therefore it is unusual for me to be proactive in getting in touch with the chief executive of a local authority in an emergency. And I think this is the only time I've actually ever done it directly at that stage of an emergency, to say, is there any more that we can do to help?
And you took that unusual step because you considered the complexity of the incident was such that there was a need for offering more support.
The combination of the messages from our team on the ground around what was happening, and also the chaotic nature of the situation. Large emergencies are often chaotic. That doesn't mean that the leading authority is failing necessarily. It just means it is chaotic, because that's it. A lot of people are affected in a lot of very profound ways. And our aim at that stage was to say, this is big, and we want to offer as much help as we possibly can.
Yes. Well, perhaps we could go to paragraph 58, where you touch upon this. And I'll read the first part of the paragraph. In the hours immediately following the Grenfell fire, it became increasingly clear to British Red Cross and others that RBKC was struggling in its efforts to organise a response to the fire. And then if I move on, the wider needs of those affected were also becoming more apparent, but with it also the capacity of the RBK response as it was being run to coordinate how those things were met. Then if we could move on to paragraph 60, which you can see on the same page. The second sentence, it was becoming clear that the RBKC response as it was not doing that to the extent that it needed to do so. In other words, provide humanitarian assistance. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that was the environment where you decided that it was necessary to make a call to Nicholas Holgate. And perhaps we can move on to that call. You mentioned at paragraph 66, we don't need to turn to it, that you first tried to call him, but he wasn't available to take your call. But in fairness, he returned your call very, very quickly thereafter.
Yes.
And then if we could turn to paragraph 67, please. You say this, on the phone call I made a number of offers to Mr Holgate of ways in which the British Red Cross could further assist RBKC's response to the Grenfell fire. These included providing practical and emotional support, access to large tents to use outside of the West Wales reception areas, assistance with cash distribution in the form of small amounts of money to be given to those who've been affected to buy food and other items, and help with coordinating the fundraising efforts. And what was Mr Holgate's response with regard to the offers you made?
It was a relatively short conversation in which he expressed gratitude for the support that we had already given in mobilising support and assistance for the rest centre, and his assessment at that time was that the only additional support that they would welcome was the support with the organising and fundraising appeal for those affected.
And in relation to one of the purposes of your call was to get an update on the relief effort, did he provide you with any update as to what was going in terms of the relief effort, what was occurring?
I don't recall there being any detail to that.
And how did the conversation end after he was polite regarding your offers, but for the majority of them didn't take them up?
I confirmed that the offer, it was an open offer for that kind of the assistance I'd made directly offered, and indeed anything else, other areas where we might be able to help or to commission help with others. And he thanked me for that, and the phone call concluded.
Can I just ask you this? This was all going on the morning of the 15th.
Correct.
You already had some people involved in the response to the disaster, is that right?
Yes.
And really this was a case of saying there's more there may be more we can do. Would you like us to help?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Would you have expected Mr Holgate or a chief executive in that situation to take you up on your offer of assistance?
Well, that all depends on the extent to which he felt he was on top of the situation.
Yes.
And that it wasn't at that stage for me to judge the relationship between the inevitably kind of chaotic and quite complex nature of the situation, and then the capability formally of Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea to handle that.
Yes.
So I took his response at face value at that stage, but ensured that he knew that the offer was open, and indeed that we would then be continuing our support and on the ground in order to attempt to continue to provide the right kind of assistance.
So your ongoing support was constant, and that open offer for additional support remained. Was there any further contact with Mr. Holgate or anyone else from ORBKC in those following days?
There was no direct contact with me in those following days with Kensington and Chelsea, but obviously the team on the ground were working with colleagues from Kensington and Chelsea all the time.
But it wasn't the case that there was a further request to the senior leadership team at the British Red Cross for greater assistance from the British Red Cross?
No.
If I can move on to the second of our three areas, which is your involvement in what became known as the Grenfell Fire Response Team. So in terms of the chronology, it's Friday the 16th of June, and is it correct that you learned that John Bardell, who's the town clerk and chief executive of the Corporation of London, City of London, had been tasked to lead the pan-London response?
That is correct.
And the term has been used as the Grenfell Fire Response Team, and that was to describe the sort of multidisciplinary team, the British Red Cross, governmental agents and local authorities. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we know from your statement at paragraph 74 that you spoke with him on the Friday evening, John Bardell, and he invited you to attend meetings at their offices over the weekend. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And it's right that you attended their offices over the weekend, staying to 10 o'clock each evening.
That's correct.
That weekend,
Yes.
the 17th of 18th of June. Perhaps we could open up paragraph 76, please, of your statement. And I'm just going to, paragraph 76, 3 lines from the bottom. In relation to what was asked of you, he confirmed that they were seeking support from us with the GFRT's communication strategy, as well as the ongoing support in the rest centre at the Westway and the establishment of a support line. Is that correct?
Yes.
So 3 areas: 1, communication strategy; 2, support in the rest centre; and 3, the establishment of a support line.
At that time, yes.
At that time.
Yeah.
In relation to the first of those 3 areas, what did you understand British Red Cross were being asked to do to assist in terms of communication strategy?
Well, because GFRT had mobilised literally overnight and into a weekend, I think they simply didn't have the communications capacity. So, in fact, there were Red Cross people from the Red Cross communications team were also in the Gold Command in the GFRT offices.
Yes.
Providing support and working with the people who were there to try to frame communications, to use social media to share information. And my understanding is that they would welcome that support. In practice, I think they used that support for a short period of time into the early part of the next week, and then mobilised capacity from the local authorities across London.
Thank you. We could perhaps deal with the support line here by way of completeness. We have Emma Sprague's written evidence, and it appears on the 15th of June she received confirmation that the BRC should use a helpline which had already been in place since the Manchester Arena incidents, and that existing helpline was there to assist Grenfell survivors and people affected by the fire. And it appears, this hopefully assists your recollection, that the support line was established and operating from the 16th of June. Does that sound about right?
It sounds about right, but I wasn't close to that decision making.
No. I just want to deal with any initial issues which you observed with the Grenfell Fire Response Team, and we can see it in front of us at paragraph 76, the paragraph we were just looking at the top. He said, "I found the position at GFRT over that weekend still to be somewhat confused, and it was difficult for me to form an objective analysis of the situation. Pausing there for a moment, I wonder if you could go to paragraph 123, please, which is another observation you've make on similar lines. Thank you. My experience of assisting with the GFRT response on the weekend of 17 and 18 June was that it remained chaotic right up until the Sunday evening. So there's two phrases we've touched upon in those two paragraphs. One of them was, it was somewhat confused, and the other one was chaotic, which we've just seen at paragraph 123. Can you assist us? In what way did you consider that the Grenfell Fire Response Team response over that weekend was somewhat confused or chaotic?
I think the situation was confused and chaotic because GFRT were themselves mobilising from a standing start, with no capacity in place to mobilise, and also then inheriting information that was very partial from Kensington and Chelsea. So that's an observation of fact as much as anything, that they were trying to make sense of a situation that was quite complex and chaotic and pull the threads together into a plan for how assistance should be provided in the days to follow.
Can you just tell us how were you following this? Were you, in a sense, in telephone communication with the response team, or were you located with them so that you could see what was going on, and how did it work?
I was the Grenfell Fire Response Team established new office premises in Westminster from the Friday evening, from which they then operated in the weeks to follow. And I went to those offices from the Saturday late morning until late Saturday evening, and then same on Sunday from in the morning through to Sunday evening. So I was there seeing the operation, and I had also been to see the operation around the Westway, around the tower itself on the Friday, to try and to get a picture of what was happening. So I felt that I was. So these comments are made on the basis of what I was observing hour by hour.
So in effect, you were integrated with the team that was running the operation.
Yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
So we're just going to explore that integration and build upon your direct observations over that weekend. Perhaps we could look at paragraph 124, please. So you're expressing how you were at the scene, and at the same time, at the scene, in other words, at the offices, I was attempting to engage with those in comparable senior leadership positions heading the response, so that we would be able, with the benefit of our mutual professional experience and capabilities, to sit down and diagnose the issues with response, i.e. to consider what had been missing from the inherited RBKC response, so we could determine where the GFRT response needed to focus its efforts. But I found it initially difficult to engage with those individuals. Why was it difficult to engage with those individuals over that weekend?
Would you mind if we scrolled through the rest of paragraph 124?
Of course. Would you like me to read the rest of it? Or would you like to go over leaf?
Just go over leaf so I can just...
Yes.
So, as I think paragraph 124 tries to get at, there was a sense of real urgency in understanding the immediate needs of the people directly impacted by the fire, and particularly those who were bereaved and had to be evacuated from the tower itself and Grenfell Walk, and that, perhaps understandably, was an absolute priority. And because GFRT itself was mobilising from a standing start, a lot of quite senior people were getting quite involved in that direct planning of trying to understand that situation. While work was done over that weekend on the way forwards, which I'm sure we'll come to in the resulting statement, it then made it difficult just to sit down and have consideration as partners about, well, what's the medium-term way forwards.
So those strategic leaders on your account were very much involved in some organisational matters on that.
Some very operational. Yes, they were very involved in some very operational matters.
Yes. And you, in fairness, to balance your comments, which I was going to move to, you say there is a difficult balance to be struck between the strategic needs assessment and planning on the one hand, and the immediate action and communication of a position on the other.
Correct, yes.
And you say more emphasis on the former might have paid dividends in the long run.
Yes. But it's a difficult balance to strike in the moment.
Correct. As you anticipate, I was going to move on to the press statement, and we'll do that in a moment, but we know over that weekend that you were asked to issue a joint press statement on behalf of the British Red Cross with the Grenfell Fire Response Team. That's mentioned at paragraph 25. That's right in front of us. And you say this: I was only willing to do so once I was clear on how the needs of the affected individuals were going to be met by the Grenfell Fire Response Team. And by the evening of Sunday, the 18th of June, I'd formed a view that there was indeed some sense of coherence emerging and the right people were becoming involved, so I felt able to make that statement. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
I felt that senior leaders from across London were coming together to try to make sense of the situation and set some kind of plan in place. And on the Saturday, I felt that wasn't clear enough for the Red Cross to be putting its name or being a partner in that visibly by the Sunday evening, but it was literally hour by hour as things became clearer. I felt that there was a greater coherence to our intentions, and it was also very important that we did communicate what our intentions were, because people need to know in terms of both the local community and more widely. There's a lot of stakeholders, and the Red Cross in its auxiliary role needs to be part of that.
And just to help perhaps us all to visualise the effort and resources which were being mobilised over that weekend, how would you describe it from your position embedded within the offices that weekend?
I would describe it as earnest, busy, trying to make sense of complexity, and but a sense of that there's a very important work to do.
Let's turn to the press statement which we refer to. It's at LFB 000-61258, please. And the press statement is an email of the press statement. It's from John Hetherington, we see at the top. 18th of June, so the Sunday at 21:49, so late in the evening, and sent to all the chief executives. And if you scroll down, thank you, it says, please see the press statement made today by the Grenfell Fire Response Team. Below, statement by Eleanor Kelly, the Chief Executive Southwark Council, on behalf of the newly established Grenfell Fire Response Team, which includes London-wide, local and regional government, central government, British Red Cross, Metropolitan Police and London Fire Brigade. Does that capture what the GFRT was?
At that stage, yes.
Yes. This is the first time that we've seen this document during inquiry, so I'm just going to read the first paragraph. We want to make clear that whilst emergency and local community response was nothing short of heroic, we know that initial response was simply not good enough on the ground. People are angry, and rightfully so. Our focus is now ensuring those affected are being cared for and looked after. And you're familiar with this press statement because one assumes that you had some input or you were consulted on its contents. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If we could go down to the next page, please, and I just want to focus upon the role of the British Red Cross as set out in this document. We see paragraph 3, and I'm going to invite us to go to a little bit further down the document, where it says, I'm pleased. I'm pleased to have the British Red Cross here to help coordinate and provide assistance where it is needed. Red Cross personnel and volunteers have been on site 24 hours a day since early Wednesday. Is that correct?
Yes.
This has so far involved a team of more than 66 volunteers alongside trained psychosocial support specialists. From today, the Red Cross will help support a more dedicated community assistance centre at the Westway Centre and will be part of teams allocated to every household affected. Today they are doing outreach work to find people who need help, and we've also asked them to be at airports to meet grieving relatives as they arrive. They can also help distribute donations that have poured in from the public. And then it sets out a Red Cross helpline is in action to help give practical or emotional support to anyone who needs it, and capacity of this has been expanded to give people a central point of contact. Did that reflect the role at that stage, what was envisaged for the British Red Cross?
Yes, from my memory, that would be an accurate statement.
Perhaps one matter of clarification was that where it refers to will be part of the teams allocated to every household affected. That sounds like a key worker role. Was it the case that the British Red Cross were involved in key worker roles?
In my role, I wasn't directly involved in that, but the intention was to match up. The intention was that the presence of the Red Cross is not only important in terms of capability to provide, assistance, but also to to show a more human-centred approach. So it wasn't simply about government response. This was about volunteers and people with experience of responding in emergencies, both in the UK and around the world, being available. And I am aware that we were supporting the teams allocated to work with the people affected. I can't comment on whether we were part of every team, but there was certainly a key worker philosophy behind it, and we were part of that.
Okay. I want to move on to another section, which is labelled principal issues. You raise a number of issues regarding what you observed in those days, and I just want to draw out some of those with you and to assist you, because it's a very, again, detailed, helpful, comprehensive statement. One of the issues you raised was the accessibility of the Westway, and I want to ask you some questions about the Westway. As you mentioned to one of the chairman's questions, you did attend the Westway, is that correct?
That's correct.
And your evidence was that your first visit was on the morning of Friday the 16th of June, and you attended the scene on a number of occasions thereafter. Is that correct?
That is correct.
If we have a look at your statements again at paragraph 94, please, which hopefully might assist us all and your recollection. And I've summarised the first part there. And perhaps we can focus on the last 3 lines where it says, attending the scene of the fire allowed me to take a view on what aspects of the response were working well, both from a GFRT and British Red Cross specific perspective, and also, and perhaps even more importantly, what was working less well. How would you describe the scene on the 16th of June, the Friday, when you attended the Westway?
Well, it's important to look at the scene in the Westway in the context of what's happening in the surrounding community as well. And it was very incredibly busy, chaotic. There was a lot of visible anger from people, a lot of people with microphones and talking to people, and huge numbers of people collecting boxes of clothes and unpacking boxes, packing boxes. So a very chaotic environment. Not unusual in a significant emergency. And then at the Westway itself, it was at a stage when there were still people in the Westway who had been evacuated from the tower or Grenfell Walk who were being accommodated there, including people who had tragically lost loved ones. So it was incredibly, it was a kind of frenetic setting with a lot of people milling around, a lot of press interest as well, and then people who were also, as I say, who were themselves bereaved tragically. And so it was a very difficult environment.
When you use the word chaotic, it conjures up in my mind at least a sense of an absence of direction or organisation. Not simply a lot of activity, but a lot of rather disorganised activity. Is that what you mean?
Well, I think in the surrounding community, it felt there was a lot of anger, and that was being expressed both viscerally by individuals and groups, and in that sense, that created a sense of there wasn't a great sense of order about it. It was it didn't feel threatening at all, but it felt just there's a lot of emotion around, and then in the Westway itself, it was there were. What happens in all emergencies, and it happened here, is the surge in donated goods. A lot of people try to help. A lot of, as I say, press interest. The area where the people who had been evacuated from the tower and the surrounding walkway were in an area that was kept separate, but it wasn't suitable for long-term, for accommodation for people who've experienced that trauma. It was a big, gym, and that's clearly not the right environment for people. But those people, they weren't. It's not that everyone was milling around that area where bereaved people or people who'd been evacuated were there, but just upstairs there was a lot of people milling around, and we're still very much in the phase of trying to help get the whole. In that transition from the immediate refuge, as it were, where people went, into the community assistance centre model, which is what then emerged over the weekend. That transition was happening in real time. So it was incredibly busy, and lots of people, and it wasn't. But I think it would be true to say we were yet to see a really ordered approach to the situation.
Yeah. Thank you. That's helpful.
Your organisation and you as Chief Executive have huge experience in dealing with emergencies, both domestically and internationally. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yes. And in relation to your expertise and your expectation, coming down on the third day after a serious emergency like the fire we experienced, would you have expected to be greeted with a scene that you were met with?
No, I would have expected more order to be being established by then.
What would you have expected? More order, but what should have happened in your view by the third day?
Well, I think by the third day you would hope that all the people who have had to be evacuated from the tower itself and people who have been bereaved would have been found more suitable accommodation, and that the rest centre itself would be perhaps more ordered, but you also have to bear in mind that the whole community was, and lots of people beyond that community were wanted to express, support, empathy, solidarity, and/or the ripple effects of the trauma from the fire itself. Went much further. All those who could see the tower, which went for miles around,
yes,
could be affected by it. So you're bound to have a lot of people milling around, and some of the challenges around therefore the attempt to put order around it in terms of managing access into the building was important, and that was an attempt to do that in order to protect the people who were still there. So I think you might expect to see a bit more order, but it's also not unusual in an emergency for that to take a few days to materialise.
We were dealing with...
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, Mr. Keating. When you first visited the Westway, were you able to identify someone who was at least nominally in charge and giving directions, or was there no one holding that role?
I don't recall meeting anyone who held that role.
And did you seek to find out who might be in that role?
I'll be honest with you, I cannot recall, but I can't imagine that I wouldn't have done.
Quite, that's what I thought. Yeah. Anyway, you can't now remember identifying someone who was clearly in charge?
No.
No. Right, thank you.
Did you consider, from what you observed and what was being fed back to you on the 16th of June and thereafter, that there was a reluctance by those who had been impacted by the fire accessing the Westway Rest Centre?
I don't think I was aware of that specifically on the 16th.
Thereafter, did you become aware of any issue in relation to that?
I did become aware of that because some of that was what started to be fed back over the weekend from some of our teams or people that were visiting the site, and that information started to come through.
So, in other words, it was something which there was an awareness that there was a lack of access, or people feeling comfortable about accessing the Westway.
There was a concern beginning to be expressed over the weekend that that the Westway operation itself was not sufficiently connected into the wider community.
Thank you. Just want to turn to paragraph 101, please. We're dealing with this topic of, we can see it perhaps paragraph 100 first, if you just scroll up slightly. You mentioned that in addition, the Westway was situated behind a police cordon, which was intended to keep people safe, and the large media presence, which you've referred to, at bay, and a number of those who were uncomfortable with police and local authorities did not wish to cross the cordon to access the Westway, instead choosing to rely on pop-up centres that have been set up by churches, mosques, community organisations and charities in the local community. The diversity and support from such a large cross-section of the local community was remarkable, but to a certain extent uncoordinated. It was not easy to work out who had been affected, particularly in absence of an efficient and comprehensive registration process, and those who were just there to help. And then you move on to paragraph 101 to say this, 3 lines down. First, both the British Red Cross and those in charge of the response, whether OBKC or the Grenfell Fire Response Team, should have realised at an earlier point that some of those affected were not accessing the Westway because they did not feel comfortable there. Although we sent community outreach teams from the week commencing the 19th of June out on the streets and to locations where people were congregating, with hindsight, it would have been better to have done this sooner to see how we could help and what was needed. We could then have made earlier decisions about how to best use our resources. Is that a fair summary of what you were just saying about the Westway not being really embedded or integrated with the wider community?
Yes, it is.
And you say it's in hindsight that's something that both ORBKC and the response team should have realised at an earlier point.
Yes.
How would they have realised at an earlier point? How would somebody be aware of this?
Well, I think, as the Red Cross, we would have much more. This is where you asked me earlier about the auxiliary role.
Yes.
And and we touched on the. Does the auxiliary role simply mean that we respond to the request from the local authority, which is what we typically do in most emergencies, Or do we additionally do needs assessments of our own and build connections with local communities and the organisations operating within them? We would now have a much broader interpretation of our role, which would continue to be to partner with the local authority, of course, but to make far more effort ourselves to build the relationship with the local community and the other organisations active within it. And had we done that, then we would have been feeding back information sooner to the local authority about the need to have a more holistic view of the overall needs and the overall response and the incredible role being played by some of these other local organisations.
So greater partnership or at least engagement with those local community, faith and voluntary organisations.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to a second issue, which is registration and data sharing, which we've heard a number of aspects of evidence in relation to that. If we could go to paragraph 68, please, of your statement. It's something you mention and place significant weight on in your evidence, written evidence, is the topic of registration. And that's what I want to explore with you as well, please. We've touched upon this paragraph already. Hopefully it's the right paragraph. Yes, it's 5 lines down, which we may have read already, but you say, this was in large part because for the first few days following the Grenfell fire, there had been no effective registration by RBKC of anyone who had been affected, with the process only taking close to 1 week to be coherently organised. Whilst the situation was undoubtedly difficult and confusing, the importance of this between its different statutory actors was not recognised sufficiently early. So it's a topic which you've touched upon a number of times, and we may have touched upon this paragraph, but I wanted to emphasise this and get your assistance in relation to the last line, that the importance of this between the different statutory actors was not recognised sufficiently early. What did you mean by that?
Well, the first step in almost any emergency response is really to understand the need and then to capture the information about the people who are most affected so that you can understand with them what their needs are and then plan the support that you'll mobilise for them, either as individually or as a group. Clearly, in the case of something like cash distribution, if you haven't registered someone, you don't have the information about who they are to give them the cash, either particularly if you're going to do it electronically.
Yes.
And nor can you ensure that the people who most need cash get it, because to make sure you don't miss anyone. And then you also make sure that you don't have multiple organisations giving the same person cash. So a registration process is very important about establishing that needs assessment, and then registration process are very important in establishing as the first steps in response to emergency, so you can plan what support to give both individually and then sometimes collectively.
And when you say the different statutory actors, who do you mean specifically?
Well, I mean the local authority, I mean the Kensington and Chelsea.
Yes.
And then I think over the weekend in the Gold Command, the GFRT was then working very hard to try to establish who had been affected and secure to have the right list of names of who lived in the tower, who had died, who was bereaved, who had been evacuated, and to work that through. That would be the starting point for being able to tailor a response to the individuals affected.
I want to deal with the responsibility for registration as a subheading. And in your view, who was responsible for the initial registration of those affected by the Grenfell Tower fire at the Westway?
I think that has to be the local authority have the responsibility for registration, not least because they have the information about who lived in the tower, which was the starting point, and indeed in Grenfell Walk.
Yes. So we've heard already in terms of a rest centre, the responsibility for setting up a rest centre is the local authority's responsibility. That's material we've heard already. We've also heard from David Curry, who is a member from OBKC, who mentioned that part of their agreement with the British Red Cross was that they would attend the rest centre and deal with the registration. I just want to tease that out a little bit more. So we have the local authority on a very simplistic interpretation saying, well, the British Red Cross are responsible for it. We have a memorandum of understanding which says that the British Red Cross will attend and bring registration forms. But the ultimate responsibility in terms of registration, who do you consider that responsibility is?
Well, the first thing I would say is there's a distinction between the registration of the people directly affected by the fire, those who died, those who were bereaved, those who were evacuated, and that is the first and most important task. And it is the only seems to be the only organisation that can do that is the local authority. They can commission assistance with that, but it has to start there. There was then the issue of registration at the Westway, where I can't speak for the specifics of this MOU, yes, but normally what would happen is that the local authority would have the responsibility for the registration and then commission help from the Red Cross or indeed anyone else to enable that to happen.
But your evidence is that it's the local authority responsible, and it may be that the British Red Cross would assist in that, but the responsibility remains with the local authority. Would that be a fair correct summary of the position?
Yes.
In terms of the length of time it took to get the registration process, to use your words at paragraph 68, more coherently organised, it took a week. Was that just an unavoidable situation, or was it? In other words, was it something which was a feature of this being an unprecedented incident, or was it something which should have been done sooner?
It should have been done sooner. It may be that the information might have been partial to start with, but it could have been built up as the information became clearer. However, different bits of information were held by different statutory authorities, and that made it, for example, in terms of our ability to then distribute the cash that we had, we found it difficult to establish exactly who we should be trying to reach with that cash, because a lot of the information was held by the police for a long period of time, and not being shared with, as far as I could understand, with the Grenfell Tower Fire Response Team.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you.
Not at all.
Can I ask you this? We know that in the immediate hours following the fire, quite a lot of places opened up as rest centres, were open, and they were opened by local people, so that probably by the noon of the day of the fire, there were half a dozen or even more rest centres operating on an informal basis. Was that, in your experience, unusual to have so many different places operating on a parallel basis?
It's not unusual in an emergency per se. So if you look at international emergencies, that would happen a lot. It's always the community who responds first. Yeah. We've not tended to see that in UK emergencies because they've not been on this scale, yeah, and required and created that the scale, size of population affected, and the density of that population meant that a lot of people were affected, and for a long period of time. So I've not seen it in a UK context before, but it was a very striking feature of this emergency.
But it does have implications, doesn't it, for the handling of the response, because it's one thing to register people at one location, it's another thing to register people who've gone to half a dozen different locations and to combine the information and to make sure you haven't got people on twice or missed people out.
That's absolutely correct. And was one of the features of this emergency and made registration. It didn't necessarily make the registration of the people who'd been in the tower difficult, because that must have existed on a list. But in terms of the people who were affected through some of the ripple effects of the emergency, it did make it difficult, and we should have been more alert to that in the early days of the response.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
In terms of the difficulties that the Grenfell Fire Response Team had in relation to make a standing start, from a standing start as you described it, perhaps we could just draw out something you've set out at paragraph 77, please. And you outline the weekend of the 17th and 18th of June. And this is what you observed. I recall a number of chief executives sitting down in a room with their own handwritten tables trying to establish lists of who'd been affected by the Grenfell fire, who'd been bereaved, who'd been made homeless, where people were being housed in temporary accommodation, what their needs were and whether, and if so how, those needs were being met. This was not a clear picture. And it was therefore not ideal that the process remained ongoing and without a clear methodology more than 3 days after the fire started. And you add, it would appear that RBKC had not been able to pass such information to Grenfell Fire Response Team. Does that accurately describe the position?
Yes, it does.
In terms of the impact of those deficiencies in the registration process, again, it's something you spend some time about. You've already mentioned that to us today, but also in your statement, and perhaps I could summarise. Paragraph 97, you say neither RBKC nor the GFRT knew who had been affected by the fire for too long a period of time. And then at paragraph 98, you say this: without a coherent registration process, it was difficult to identify who had been affected, their needs, and how best to address those needs. It was also sometimes not clear where those who had been affected actually were. Many people were being housed in temporary accommodation, but it was sometimes difficult to work out where they were so they could be checked on and offered further support. And in relation to that latter part, that's those who were placed in hotels, there was a concern that there wasn't an understanding where they were and how they could be supported. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I'm just going to move on to a subset of this topic of registration, which is data sharing or data protection, whichever way you want to look at it from. And you mentioned about some of the difficulties in getting information from other statutory actors as you described it. And perhaps we could look at paragraph 97 in relation to this, please. The second sentence: I believe this issue was further complicated by concerns over data protection issues that had arisen, which made it difficult for the police and other agencies to share the information that they did have with the Grenfell Fire Response Team for fear of breaching the relevant laws or regulations. And something which we'll explore in our third section is your view that this should be improved for the future. Is that correct?
Yes.
Going back into those experiences in June 2017 and efforts to address that at that time, were there any steps taken to address the data protection issues at that time, to try to get more information shared?
I'm in terms of what others did, I'm not sure. For us, it really mattered because we wanted to be able to mobilise financial support to those people directly affected. And if we didn't have the list of names and contact details, we couldn't do that. And so I was, pressing my team for information about, well, who are the decision makers on this? And I understood the information to be being held by the police, and trying to secure the name of the lead police liaison officer or family liaison officer who might be able to help us to resolve the issue, and it just took a long time.
It's probably very hard to put a figure on that, but can you assist in relation to how long it took for you to be confident that you had the sufficient information you required?
Well, I can't recall, but I would think it was over a week before we started to get that information from memory.
And again, from your wider experience domestically, is that unusual, or is that one of the features, even now, of multi-agency work?
Well, data sharing is always an issue, and as I'm sure we'll come on to discuss, I think that the burden of proof should be to show why you wouldn't share information rather than the other way around.
Let's perhaps explore those matters now, if we can, discreetly, and perhaps starting from the Civil Contingency Act perspective. Was there, in your view, an awareness of the CCA regulations which provide that Category 1 or 2 responders may disclose information on requests in connection with the performance of their functions in emergencies, specifically Regulations 45 to 54? Was there an understanding amongst those statutory actors of that power?
Specifically in this context, I don't know.
In terms of, you described this as data sharing is always an issue. In what ways do you consider that the registration and perhaps more importantly the data sharing process could be improved for the future?
I think if there was a clearer understanding of why registration and then the sharing of that information with other partners is so important to be able to provide assistance, then those people in those statutory organisations their bias would be to share the information in the first place because of the help that it would enable. And that requires some peripheral vision of what is, what each actor is part of. And I'm not a lawyer, I can't comment on the specifics of the data protection legislation and what was possible at that time or indeed what's possible now. But I think that all actors should be trying to share that information in order to enable assistance to be provided while paying due attention to the confidentiality of the information overall with a wider community.
Well, let's draw out paragraph 117 where you've discussed this in your statement. And you say this: a further area in which the response could have been assisted was for greater clarity to have been given by the government in relation to the exchange of personal data in relation to affected individuals. It was apparent to me that either data protection laws or the perception of the requirements of such laws inhibited the efficient exchange of personal data to support the registration process and enable humanitarian support. We know that in relation to the work of the British Red Cross that there was a number of reports which were commissioned and published in the wake of Grenfell Tower and other emergencies and tragedies which took place in 2017. Is that right?
Yes.
And in relation to one of those, perhaps we could open up the documents, INQ 000-15093. We can see one of the latter documents, which was dated November 2019. And it's called People Power in Emergencies. And it's an assessment of voluntary and community sector engagement and human-centred approaches to emergency planning. We're going to return to this a little bit later, but if we could go to page 20 of the document, please. And at the bottom left of the screen, thank you very much, it says this. This is a report which was you have seen and commissioned, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And the British Red Cross recommends that data sharing code of practice of the Information Commissioner's Office and the Cabinet Office's data protection and sharing guidance for emergency planners and responders endorse statutory authorities working with voluntary sector organisations to build more constructive working relationships and agree new clear protocols for effective information sharing. So something in the public sphere is something that the British Red Cross have raised, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And just perhaps to bring this up to date, in relation to the first part, which is the data sharing code of practice of the ICO, are you aware that since this report, which is November 2019, the Information Commissioner's Office have published an update to its data sharing code of practice, which is published in December 2020 and has come into force in October 2021. Were you aware of that?
I wasn't personally aware.
I'm not going to ask you any more in relation to that if you're not aware of that that's come into force. But to an extent, one of the matters that you recommended has been addressed, which is the data sharing code. That's one factor. The second factor, your organisation have recommended related to Cabinet Office data protection and sharing guidance for emergency planners and responders. Now, in relation to that, it appears to be non-statutory guidance issued by the Cabinet Office, and the current version appears to be 2007. Does that sound about right to you, the document that we're referring to?
I'm not sure.
So it's something which you don't now, being put on the spot, have a direct recollection as to any changes in relation to that.
I'm not directly familiar with the legal framework,
of course,
other than in general terms. But what is key is that people then that the actors in an emergency act upon that guidance in order to share information, and that they know that they can do that.
So one aspect is understanding of the guidance, and then it's the application of that, which requires, one would assume, better knowledge and training. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We can put the data sharing to one side for a moment and move on, please, to one of the third issues, which one of the issues you've raised, which is the third one that I'm drawing out, is community engagement. And the first British Red Cross report, which was commissioned in the advent of these incidents in 2017, was called Harnessing the Power of Kindness. And that was published in 2018. And perhaps we could have a look at that. It's BRC 6066, please. And it says it there, it's designed to harness the power of kindness for communities in crisis towards a more effective response to emergencies in the UK. But in summary, there was significant reflections, is this fair to say, by the British Red Cross in the wake of a number of terrorist attacks and the Grenfell Tower fire of British Red Cross and the voluntary sector, and what lessons could be learned.
That's correct. 2017 was a watershed year for emergencies in the UK, and therefore for the way all parties, I hope, think about emergencies, and certainly for the British Red Cross, we learnt a lot and about the way in which we operate.
Yes. And really, if that watershed is what we're going to explore, we're now in our sort of third real area of it. We're going to draw out some of those matters. But perhaps we could turn to page 6, please, of this. And looking backwards before we look forwards, first of all, it says this at the top of the page, in the right-hand column. The British Red Cross has been upfront about where our response did not meet our high standards. This is perhaps making a reference to matters you've made in other media. The Grenfell Tower fire in particular showed that some of our established ways of working are not responsive enough to local needs, and highlighted where we did not communicate effectively enough with statutory and other voluntary organisations. Is there anything else you wanted to add in relation to that sort of reflective approach that the British Red Cross and that view that arrived that certain things didn't work?
We recognised, particularly through the Grenfell Tower response, that we were not connected soon enough into that network of local organisations that were also, as we discussed earlier, opening their doors in the early hours of that Wednesday morning and building an effective network of relationships with them in order to understand overall needs. And since that time, we have done a lot to correct that, both in the way in which we approach our response in an emergency to be needs-based and inclusive, but also through the institutional structures that we have invested in and which we host and co-chair around a national and local partnership of voluntary organisations ready to respond in an emergency. And recognising that those small local organisations are often going to be better informed about a community's needs than we are because they're rooted in it.
Well, that may be a helpful way, and I'm going to go into those structures probably after the mid-afternoon break. But the last observation you made might be a helpful way to turn to paragraph 144, please. You talk about small local organisations and applying this back to Grenfell Fire. In fact, we could turn to paragraph 145, please. Thank you. And you say this. The question of how best to help might have also been better addressed how do we engage more quickly and more directly with the community leaders. And this is the part I'm trying to focus upon. The vast majority of whom were quietly and capably offering aid to those in need without much, if any, input from RBKC or the Grenfell Fire Response Team. And that was your assessment of the impact, was it, of the local organisations and the community leaders?
Yes, that's not a formal objective assessment. It's a sense of
yes.
The community responding, supporting its own, and really stepping up.
Is it possible to translate these quite broadly worded aspirations into how they might have been put into practical application in the particular circumstances of the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, I think
what do you think should have happened, in other words?
Yeah, well, I think the operational leadership of both the local authority response and indeed the Red Cross response as well should have realised that actually the whole community had surged from the early hours of the morning. I'll always remember speaking to the leader of one of the local youth organisations who'd opened their doors at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they'd never been involved in an emergency ever before or ever thought of themselves as an emergency organisation. And the once you realise that, and that actually then the consequence is that the leaders, the overall coordinators of the response need to be reaching out to those leaders of those other organisations and bringing them together. And that could be from the mosques or from the churches or the youth organisations, and then trying to make sense of need together and and what the overall response should be to make it more likely that that ecosystem will address the right things, while the formal response would still focus on the housing issues of those who've been evacuated from the tower. So you'd have a mix of the formal and informal, but being orchestrated in a much more informed way.
Well, that I think I understand, but I'm just wondering how you would go about identifying the leaders of the community in, imagine, the first 3 or 4 hours, perhaps half a dozen hours after the fire. I mean, would you go to the people who are opening the churches or rugby club?
Yes, you would, absolutely. Because it is a very small geographical area.
Yeah.
It's probably only a square mile or something like that.
Yeah.
Actually, it's all within walking distance. This is not, it is very doable and reachable. It would also continue to be complex. It wouldn't, but you would be building the links with the people who would, in the medium term, be helping the community recover, because they're there before, during, and after, and they would be helping you inform about both what people's needs are in general, and indeed of some of the people who had not come forward to the Westway, but act because they were fearful of authority for whatever reason, but actually might need help. And therefore, the overall response would be more coherent. But yes, you would go and we would assign people and capacity to go and have those conversations.
Yeah, I was going to say, so your first team on the ground would spread themselves out and go and talk to any informal rest centres, or those who are running them or opening them, and move on from there. Is that how you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Would the application of this principle be enhanced if there was better pre-existing relations with some of the local community, faith or voluntary organisations?
Yes. I mean, the key in an emergency, in a way, is to make friends before you need them. So to have connected people and organisations up in advance, and some of the practical steps we're taking to make that more likely through the institutional arrangements that we'll talk about later is all about trying to make those connections in advance of an emergency. And the same would then, there was a very, in the parlance, there was a lot of social capital in that community, a lot of organisations, a lot of very dynamic people and leaders who were, who already knew each other. And actually could have been harnessed more effectively earlier on in the process.
The final topic I just want to deal perhaps with the Chairman's leave would be donations, and before we perhaps could have a break. Donations, physical donations, a very important area. We've heard a lot about the kindness and the outpouring of public generosity. And in relation to that, did you consider that the volume of donations, physical donations, perversely had an adverse impact on the emergency response?
Yes, and this is very common in emergencies of a sudden onset nature, where people want to show their kindness by giving something. The challenge is that that something that somebody wants to give may not be what the person who's affected by the emergency needs or wants. And in the early phase of an emergency, people often do prefer to get the physical goods, because actually if you've just had to leave your home, you might want a change of clothing. That might be what you need, and you might need clothing there and then. But by day 3 or 4, you're getting ready, you want to choose your own clothes. And actually, in this case, there were nearly 200 tonnes of donated goods of varying quality, which were not what people wanted.
Yes. So in relation to that, you mentioned a couple of things which perhaps I could just deal with very briefly. You mentioned that the share of volume of the physical donations overwhelmed those in charge of the response at ORBKC. You said that in paragraph 154. And you add that a lot of time and resource was spent by the British Red Cross, volunteers and others assisting with the response, attempting to sort through those donations. That's paragraph 105. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, it is.
And in terms of, you mentioned in your statement at paragraph 153 that there would be limited circumstances, probably those early stages where physical donations would assist. But you mentioned that with the greatest respect, that cash is both easier to handle and gives those affected by an emergency choice and dignity about the help that they need. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the phrase dignity and choice is the view that if somebody has the financial support, that then they have a degree of control over what they choose to buy and feel that they have got some autonomy over their circumstances.
That's exactly right. And if I just gave an example of meeting one of our volunteers who was helping in the Westway, and she described a situation of a mother who had been evacuated, I think, from one of the neighbouring streets, but who had 3 disabled children up to the age of 10, all of whom needed nappies. But when you looked at everything that was in the Westway, it was only babies' nappies. She needed something different.
Yes.
And we gave her cash. She could then go and get what she needed. It was all available. So there's a much better matching process of what people need and their ability to get it if you give them cash, particularly after the immediate shock or period of the emergency. But that's within 24 hours.
And the final point in relation to this is that in the Harnessing the Power of Public Kindness report, that one we saw a moment ago in 2018, it recommended that guidance should be issued to inform people early on as to which goods are most likely to be used and give the information they need about supporting in other ways, i.e. financial support. So, in essence, recommending education of the public in relation to this. Is that correct?
Yes.
And are you aware whether any changes or guidance has been implemented or published in relation to this since 2017?
Well, as the British Red Cross, we continue to promote and encourage people to give cash rather than donated goods, and indeed in the context of the response to Ukraine, the same issues apply of where goods are being shipped across Europe to a European Union country when cash would be much better. So government has also been supportive of that. But you're trying to change a practice and the desire to be kind by people, and it's not just about information. We have to keep chipping away with that information to help people to see why and build up a community of people who realise why cash is better.
That's probably the reason why the title of the first report is called Harnessing the Power of Public Kindness.
Exactly.
Mr. Chairman, is that a suitable moment?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, we have a break during the session, Mr. Adamson, and this is a good time to take it. So we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 20 to 4. And I have to ask you, please, as I have every other witness, please don't talk about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room. All right?
Understood.
Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher then, please? Thank you very much, Mr. Keating. 20 to 4, then, please. Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Adamson to come back in, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Adamson, ready to carry on, I hope?
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Keating?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Adamson, welcome back. We're moving now to the third area we promised to deal with, which is this lessons learned and looking forward in terms of suggested changes to, in particular, the area in relation to the voluntary sector post 2017. And you described 2017 in general terms as a watershed year in relation to the experiences that BORC had. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the report which we had open and we referred to just before the break is the 2018 report, Harnessing the Power of Kindness for Communities in Crisis. Perhaps we could open that up, please, and just deal with some general principles first, which were identified by British Red Cross. And at page 6, I'm very grateful we have it already open, and we could look at the right column, and it says this. Thank you, just waiting for mine to open up. We are more convinced, in bold, than ever that effective emergency response is truly human-centred, focusing on the individuals and communities at the heart of an emergency. This means there's a need to ensure people have timely and compassionate access to the support they need in that moment, whether this is practical, emotional, or financial. So that's an expression by the British Red Cross where you're convinced more than ever that it needs to be human-centred. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's try to explore that expression by the British Red Cross and its application. If we turn over to page 7, where 8 principles are identified to form the framework for dealing with a crisis. And they are set out there. We can see it in front of us, the summary of the principles, and I'm going to touch upon some of those if we can. Putting people first, principle 1 to 3, which is there. And we can see at principle 2, people should expect a coordinated and high quality response in and after an emergency. Principle 3, people should be supported in their local communities and local communities should be empowered to respond. Then we see in relation to principles 4 and 5, ensuring people can access the support they need quickly and feel safe and confident to do so. And one of the features in relation to the Westway we discussed was accessibility, wasn't it? And people feeling comfortable and able to access that ability. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And then this is one matter which we have touched upon in briefly during the inquiry, but have written evidence in relation to principle 5, that people should have access to social and psychological support as well as the practical help they need. Is that correct?
Yes.
And lastly, really within the theme that you've mentioned before the break, harnessing kindness following a major incident. Education where people should know how to give their financial support in an emergency, and people should be supported to give in ways that will help the most vulnerable. Is that correct?
Yes.
So these are the expression of principles which are identified by the British Cross. And is it your view that this should be the framework that underpins an emergency response?
Yes, we think there's so much learning from the events of 2017 and then indeed subsequent events that's continued with COVID and other emergencies, that there's an opportunity to do it better, and that emergency response is often, and risk management are often quite technical disciplines, in fact, and some of the language can get technical and lose sight of the human beings who actually need help, and that once the fire's put out or once the ambulance has taken someone to the hospital, the recovery process starts to take place from the first 24 hours onwards, and that's very much that's a human process.
And after these were your learnings as an organisation, reflecting those incidents that you experienced as an organisation in 2017, and once identifying those principles, is it right that there was another report in 2019, if we could open up, Ready for Anything, putting people at the heart of the emergency, INQ 000 15089. So of the three reports, this is the second one in time. This is early 2019. And in essence, what appears is that British Red Cross then undertook sort of surveys and consulted with a number of stakeholders, including the public, as to the application of those principles and try to get some more information as to what people wanted. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, and the reason that we did that is that in the years up to 2017, with the exception of the London bombings of 2005, which are obviously enormous in their impact and implications, the characteristics of most of the emergencies in the UK had been relatively small scale. And we saw that from the events of 2017, and then when you looked to the future with the potential impact of climate change, of cyber attacks, of terror attacks and so on, that emergencies in the UK were going to be much more of a feature of the lives of all of us. And therefore understanding how people thought about emergencies, both the public themselves and other stakeholders, was an important part of building a picture of how we could improve the resilience of the nation.
Yes, and of course this is all pre-COVID. This is 2019, the work you've undertook. And in essence, the report was based on interview with staff, volunteers and people who'd experienced emergency situations, and as well as a survey of 5,000 members of the public. Is that what underpinned this report?
Yes.
And I'm just going to summarise matters which are set out in the report, and then we're going to turn to the executive summary. But in essence, the report explored what people need and want before, during and after an emergency. And of course, while recognised needs can be highly individualised, is it fair that 4 broad themes of needs were identified?
I'm sure that's the case.
I think let me help you, because I know there's a number of documentation you've assisted with us. Let's open up at page 2, please. And this should assist your page 5, actually. Forgive me. Trying to find the right page for you. Actually, it's page 4. Thank you so much. Executive summary. And if you see immediate practical needs, so there's 4 main areas which were drawn out. Immediate needs when crisis hits include food, shelter, medication, but there's a need for privacy and to feel safe. Those basic needs was the first matter. Secondly, mental health and psychosocial support. And it says here, this is a hugely significant factor in the early stages of recovery. Those psychological needs should be treated as equal to a person's physical health. This includes an empathetic need, to give time to reflect and to tell their story, to make sense of what happened and to feel in control of what happened next. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And I'm not going to invite us to look at it, but at page 32 of the report, it says this: when we spoke to those who'd been involved in emergency situations about what advice people might need, one issue that came up was how complicated the system was and how there needed to be support. And that was one of the reasons underpinning the need for advice, support and advocacy. Is that correct, which we see just at the top right-hand column?
Yes, it is. Could I just reference the mental health and psychosocial support?
Of course.
Again, just to say, because I can't remember whether it's this report or one of the other reports, but an important distinction. Of course, all of us, the whole society has been on there's much greater recognition of mental health needs and their criticality now than there was 5 years ago or even three years ago.
Yes.
I think one of the most important things that we draw out in this suite of reports, because they're a set of connected reports,
Correct.
in fact, is that while there is greater recognition of the need for mental health support in the aftermath of an emergency, there's less recognition of the immediate need for psychosocial support right in the moment. So mental health support via the NHS may get mobilised in the weeks following, but actually it's in the immediate aftermath of an emergency that often that may be missing in terms of the need for support right at that time.
Yes, indeed, you set out in the report there's a danger that this is overlooked and not prioritised.
Exactly.
And the psychological impact of a major incident is likely to affect not just those who've been physically injured, but a much larger number of people too. Is that a fair summary from the suite of reports about the importance of this type of help?
Yes, and that the psychological effects may manifest themselves at even years after the emergency itself. And for the people affected by the Grenfell Tower fire, of course, all those who could see the fire, could see the tower, and can still see it, could be affected by it and the trauma that could trigger.
So we dealt with, that was the second of the themes which were identified, and we were just touching upon advice, support and advocacy, and identifying how people affected by emergency will need help with navigating systems. And it says it's important that this help is both coordinated and consistent. Critically, support must empower those affected to take control of their own recovery. It must also provide a platform or voice for victims and affected community needs. Just exploring that for a moment, in what way would you see that materialising, how support must empower those affected to take control of their own recovery?
Well, I think that in a way there's two precursors to that.
Yes.
Firstly, every emergency is different, and every individual is affected differently by it in terms of what their needs are, and whether those are, they might have lost their livelihood, they might have lost their house, they might be affected by the trauma of what they've experienced, or they may have not had very high coping capacity to start with. They were disabled or frail and elderly, or whatever, or marginalised and not feeling able to access authority and trusting in authority. So all needs are different. So the key point we're making here is that actually we need to be engaging with people as individuals and getting alongside them, and that can be through well-trained volunteers who have high degrees of empathy and who've been trained in handling supporting people who've been through traumatic situations to explore where they are and what they want to be able to do, and then putting together the packages of support that will help them get back on a stable path and take control of their lives. So that's all about understanding the individual and then them having, again, to use the parlance of the day, having agency. Yes. In actually managing the way forwards.
I skipped over, but not by accident, information and communication. I just wanted to deal with that one last, which is the bottom left-hand corner. And it says this includes a need for leadership and organisation for accurate, accessible and timely information and the ability to contact and communicate with family and friends. And later on in a report, it says this at page 26 of the report: sharing information can also help lessen the psychological impact of an emergency by providing reassurance, clarity, and managing expectations. Is that right?
Yes.
So the more important the impact communication can have, it can lessen the psychological effect of an incident.
Yes, but what's important is that all of the people who are affected by an emergency have information about what's happening and where they can get support. And that's important not only for the person or people directly affected, but also for their family and friends who will be worried and concerned about them. And so good information is key to helping support people through the recovery process. Well, in fact, through the response potentially, but then also through a recovery process.
And one practical matter which has flowed from this is it right that in relation to the general ability of the public to access support, is that post-2017 that there's now a single support line which has been set up called the National Emergency Support Line. Is that correct?
We have, I don't think there's a standing National Emergency Support Line, but when there is an emergency, apologies, let me backtrack. We have a standing National Emergency Support Line, but then what we do, it then surges according to what the emergencies are that dealing with. So it surged during COVID, and then we put in extra capacity to handle the number of calls coming in, and then we scaled it back, and then it has. Well, in fact, it's surging right now to support the arrival of Ukrainian refugees who are seeking support and cash and SIM cards and all that practical help that we're able to give.
So the difference now compared to back in 2017, where there was issues in relation to utilising and setting up a specific support line, is that the British Red Cross, as an auxiliary to government, has this infrastructure set up, which, as you described, can be scaled up to reflect an incident.
That's correct. It was a capability to create one before, which we did. It's now a permanent capability that we scale according to the emergency that we're dealing with at the time.
The second of the three areas I wanted to explore in this last part of your evidence is under the label multi-agency response and the role of the voluntary sector. You mention in your statement, we don't need to turn to it, at paragraph 127, is that there is a need to strengthen working relationships between all those responding to emergencies on this scale in the future. And I just wanted to explore that a little bit more. Did you consider back in 2017 that there was an issue regarding how the voluntary and community sector was externally perceived or valued?
I think it was pre-2017, it was a different world because, as I observed earlier, there was a sense that actually the emergencies taking place in the UK were, with some notable exceptions, of relatively small scale. And actually, the arrangements we had in place were fine for the kind of challenges that we faced. After 2017, and then I think intensified by all the events that we've seen since, there is a realisation that emergencies are going to be a feature of UK life for the years to come, and actually we needed to revitalise the relationships and relationships between and capabilities of the different actors in the voluntary community sector, but also of central and local government.
So you've described how the world we're facing is changing. Paragraph 132 of your statement, we don't need to turn to it. It says this: there is still inconsistent recognition by those authorities of the importance of the voluntary and community sector in any response to those communities and their recovery from emergency. And you set out how that, in your view, was a wasted opportunity. Is that correct? Or was it correct as of 2017?
I think that if you look at the documentation and words that are set out in various documents from government about it, there is a clear recognition that the voluntary and community sector is important to enabling really good outcomes for the people who are recovering from an emergency, and this recognition of the distinction between the immediate response and then their actual recovery and people able to get back on with their lives again. And as the voluntary sector, and I think it's fair to say led by the British Red Cross and certainly facilitated by us, we have put a huge amount of effort into building the connections between national and local voluntary organisations to make it through a collaboration called the Voluntary Community Sector Emergency Partnership, to make it more likely that organisations, such as some of those local ones that we discussed earlier, actually did open their doors in the middle of the night, yes, to make it more likely that they're familiar with what it takes to respond in an emergency, and that indeed that might be asked of them. Yes. So we've formed a partnership which is now 150 partners, about 20 to 30 nationals and about 120 locals, who are committed to building the connections in advance of emergencies, doing joint training, seeking to build partnerships with central and local government, and also to make it easier for central and local government to work with our sector, because otherwise we can look quite diffuse, to try and make it easier for central and local government to work with us so that genuinely we can form the kind of partnership that will help the nation be more resilient in this more turbulent world that will result in practical terms in more emergencies, whether caused by cyber attacks, climate change, terror attacks, or whatever.
So there's a lot in there. which is very helpful. Thank you. And we probably can distill to a few things. In 2018, Harnessing the Power of Public Kindness report refers to a phrase, fragmentation, and how there is a need to heal the fragmentation between statutory and voluntary services and between national and local voluntary organisations. That's page 6 of that report. That's in 2018. Just having that in mind, that fragmentation. And you've mentioned that the voluntary and community sector emergency partnership has been set up since then. And you're the chair of that organisation, isn't that correct? Or you were the chair of that organisation?
I'm co-chair.
Co-chair.
With the chief executive of the umbrella body for local organisations, and that's symbolising the partnership between national and local.
Is that the National Association for Voluntary and Community Act?
It is.
Yes. NAFCA.
Yes.
Yes. So, as co-chair of that new partnership, something which is set up post 2017, do you think that has addressed the fragmentation which was identified in the 2018 report?
I think it's making progress in addressing the fragmentation, but that is a long journey, because there are, many thousands of local voluntary organisations, and there is also a need to strengthen the relationships at every level with government, and to build those relationships, and so so we are addressing the fragmentation, but we're on a journey to do that.
So this partnership would have any engagement with national government, the voluntary and community sector emergency partnership? Would that be an organisation which would communicate with central government, or be that sort of interface?
It would not only communicate with central government, but it attempted to design in to the emergency partnership steering group membership by central government, so that we are in the room together to try to look at, well, what are the threats, hazards and risks that the nation faces,
yes,
and then how can we be better prepared for them.
Let's go down a level to another subheading, which is the local resilience forums, and query whether there's inconsistent partnership, which is something raised in the suite of reports we've discussed. Something which is set out as a summary, and you can perhaps confirm is this correct in one of the reports, is that the responsibility for crisis planning and response at a local level in England lies with 38 local resilience forums, bringing together, amongst others, emergency responders, local authorities, the NHS, and local voluntary and community sector organisations. Is that accord with your recollection?
Yes.
And in relation to, we've heard about the local authority panel and sector panels. When it comes to the voluntary sector, there's also voluntary sector panels which feed in to these local resilience forums. Is that correct?
Yes. But the arrangements can vary quite a lot between different local resilience forums.
Okay. I think we've seen for London as an example that there is a voluntary sector panel, yes, and a number of other panels as well. Perhaps we could, I can lead in relation to this, in relation to the 2018 report. It says at page 8, recent events show that there's no guaranteed consistency across areas in terms of the effectiveness of the structures and plans of emergency response. Some voluntary sector panels are not elected or representative and not properly included as part of the design and delivery of emergency response. So that is at page 8 of Harnessing the Power of Public Kindness report. So against that background, it's revisited again in the report that we have right in front of us, People, Power and Emergencies, which was published in late 2019, as we heard. And perhaps we could turn, please, to page 9 for the executive summary of this. This is, in fact, it's not the document. I'm going to give you the reference numbers, INQ 000-15093. I'm getting my reports mixed up. So the final report in the suite, late 2019. And if we could turn to page 9, please. Okay, thank you very much. We see in an introduction the reference to the 38 local resilience forums. And on the right-hand side is key findings. It says, local resilient forums typically only engage with voluntary sector organisations that have experience of emergency response work, missing out on insights and expertise of a broader range of voluntary and community sector organisations. And then it says overleaf. Page 2, please, of this, or page 10 as we are looking at it. There are barriers to communication and engagement, top left, between local resilience forums and voluntary and community sector organisations. And it follows, isn't it, that this co-report between you and the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action, they undertook a survey of local voluntary sector organisations. And we can see at page 17 the outcome in relation to this survey about these barriers to communication. And it says this: all three strands of research found that communication and engagement between local resilience forums and voluntary and community sector organisations was inconsistent. That's the word we've used a number of times now. And it says NAVCA, that's the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action, survey of local voluntary sector organisations found that 91%, 41 of 45, were not aware of their local resilient forums plans. And 62%, 28 of 45, said that there was barriers to good communications with local resilience forums. And it says a little bit later on that there was an issue regarding plans not being widely accessible online. So in relation to this, these barriers to communication being at best inconsistent, is that something which, in your view, remains a concern?
Yes, it does. You wouldn't expect everything to be the same because the geographical contexts are different. In rural areas, densely packed urban areas, richer areas, poorer areas. But you expect some consistency in terms of the ambition for partnership between the sectors to enable better preparedness and resilience to ensure better outcomes when an emergency takes place. And we still have some way to go in establishing the arrangements for that.
And is there some way that you can see that being improved? Is there a magic formula to bring consistency to an area where there's inconsistency?
There is no magic formula. What there is, but we have opportunities to do it better. And those opportunities include the current review of the Civil Contingencies Act and its guidance, and the work that is underway on the development of a national resilience strategy, and the impetus. Those are the practical things happening in central government right now. But in addition, we have an opportunity because of the impetus created by the country's experience around COVID, but also the way in which people have actually shown great solidarity in responding to the arrival of Afghan refugees and indeed Ukrainian refugees now, to create a different kind of dialogue about what would good look like. And the work that we're trying to do through the emergency partnership is all about trying to create the conditions for those kind of conversations.
Yes.
To develop at local and indeed at national level.
Just going to move on to plans, local resilience forum plans, which are touched upon in this report at page 10, please. I'm going to deal with it briefly, I hope fairly. And it says this at the paragraph, the left-hand column, second paragraph. Whilst most local resilient forum plans broadly covered the practical and psychosocial needs of individuals and communities at times of crises, the plans did not offer detailed guidance on flexible approaches to support. And it says, in particular, a lack of personalised support. Most plans covered basic humanitarian needs, yet did not consider how much support could be personalised. And that gives an example. 85% of local resilience forums plans were reviewed mentioned providing food, yet only 44% considered dietary requirements. An illustration, perhaps a basic illustration of that point. And the prioritisation of short-term needs. The emergency plans consistently prioritise short-term needs over longer-term support. And longer-term issues tended to be considered within the remit of other bodies such as local authorities, or were featured in other specific plans such as the recovery plan. Just dealing with that for a moment and the tension between emergency response and emergency and recovery effectively. And we've heard already in relation to recovery, that's something which is normally led by the local authority. There's statutory guidance in relation to the former, emergency response. There's non-statutory guidance in relation to the latter, recovery. Do you think, or have you a view in relation to the status of the guidance for emergency recovery?
I mean, we would like to see the review of the Civil Contingency Act and its guidance, and indeed the National Resilience Strategy, put much more emphasis on that, about the recovery process and the need to recognise the different needs of different people in different circumstances. That's our position. Where I would absolutely acknowledge there's challenges is when you have the interaction between long-term vulnerability and that is then when somebody who is vulnerable anyway or in it or affected by very significant health inequalities, for example, as we've all realised during the COVID period, actually it's hard then to separate out the recovery process from the situation they were already in. So it is messy, and we see the same in our international work. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have the ambition to do it much better by really focusing everything around people. The National Risk Register could be focused more around the impact on people of those risks. There's opportunities to build that into the frameworks and the ways in which we think and work, and therefore into our training and the partnerships that we have.
Could I just focus on one word you use, vulnerability, because it was the last point I wanted to deal with in relation to plans, and then I'm going to deal with finally, the wider recommendations which you've alluded to in your answer. If we could go to page 24, please, of this report, People Powers in Emergencies. And it's the point it makes here regarding vulnerability. The review found the local resilient forums needed to go much further to consider and address the varied vulnerabilities faced by local populations. It says only 30% of local resilient plans, which were examined, 8 out of 27, included a definition of vulnerability, and not all plans included measures for identifying and helping people. Was that something which was drawn out from this report, which was of significance?
Yes, it's very significant that we're recognising the people who often get missed because they're not part of the big crowd that is affected by the emergency, or the majority. And actually it's about addressing the vulnerability that individuals and groups have within the whole population.
And perhaps we've got a pictorial illustration at the bottom. If you could scroll down a little bit, we see of the plans from the local resilience forums which were examined, there was 27, we see that the local plans which cater for categories of vulnerability. At the top would be non-English speakers, but equally it shows that perhaps that's 2/3 of plans refer to that specifically. And then we see towards the bottom a number of areas of categories of vulnerability which have got little or no recognition. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm grateful for your patience and the panel's patience. I'm going to move on to the final point, which deals with what you have said regarding changes to the Act and the framework. And indeed, this report calls for a wider review of the regulations and guidance, as you've said today, so that it outlines, quote, a clearer role for the voluntary sector. And if we actually turn to page 11 of this report, we could see that, please. Thank you. Let's the top right-hand side of the page, it says, enshrining a clearer role for the voluntary sector would also ensure that voluntary and community organisations were consistently and thoroughly embedded within local resilience forums, improving their ability to plan a human-centred approach. Okay, so that's what the report, the last report in this suite that we've gone through, sets out, and the reasons why you consider it's necessary for that embedding to take place. It's how that's done I want you to perhaps try to assist the panel with. Do you consider the Act and the regulations as insufficient, or is it a case that the enabling powers, which we've just referred to, the Act and the regulations, are not being applied correctly? Is it a framework or is it a delivery? Would probably be a simple way of putting it.
It's both, because the framework uses the phrase that the local resilience forum should have regard to the role of the voluntary sector. We think there's an opportunity in the Civil Contingency Act or its guidance to actually require a partnership with the voluntary and community sector in order to, and we think that there is considerable evidence of the role the voluntary and community sector has played in practice in this series of emergencies to which the country's had to respond since 2017, or through 2017 and thereafter. And therefore that the framework could be considerably strengthened, and then that the assurance of the application of the framework could also be strengthened to, for example, begin to address and make more transparent the inconsistencies in the ways in which local resilience forums approach their task, their very difficult task, but to endeavour to shine a light on good practice, and then, but also to address and pull up poor practice,
okay,
or where practice could be better. And we think, and then to actually create an expectation of leaders, both in our sector, as a voluntary community sector, to act in responsible and engaging ways with their statutory sector partners. There's an onus on us as well, but also on leaders in local and central government to engage with us, and to engage with us properly, so that we can ensure a better coordinated response that is in the interest of the people we're all here to serve.
Thank you. I'm just going to draw out a few things you mentioned there. You mentioned that the framework, the regulations, make reference to that the Category 1 responder, or the LRF, should have regard to the role of the voluntary sector. And that's Regulation 23 is what you're specifically referring to. And what you said there is that you consider that to be insufficient. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And you've suggested that there should be a more firmer legal basis where a Category 1 responder, or LRF, is, well, Category 1 responder actually, is under a duty to be in partnership with the voluntary sector. Forgive me.
Yes, that is correct.
And I wanted to just explore what you were saying about assurance in relation to that, to try to avoid the inconsistency which is set out as an issue within the reports we referred to. The panel have touched upon in evidence as it then was, the standards for London, which in due course still here have been superseded by the resilience standards for London. In relation to focusing on London for a moment, do you consider that the current either national resilience standards or the London resilience standards is sufficient to provide assurance of civil contingency capability?
I can't comment on the London resilience standards specifically. What I would say is that I don't think that the mechanisms for assurance in the round are good enough, and indeed there's an opportunity to consider the status of local resilience forums, the expectations of the resourcing of local resilience forums, the standards for them, and to make that much more transparent and ensure that it's regularly reviewed, so that when an emergency does happen, all parties and partners are ready to respond in a coordinated way. And we have made suggestions about, for example, peer review processes and so on that could be used to help with some of those things, for example.
And your basis for having concerns regarding the assurance basis, where does that derive from?
It's from our experience of across the country of working with different local resilience forums, and I think it would be a widely recognised view,
Yes.
In fact, of the current situations. Notwithstanding that many local resilience forums are doing an excellent job in very difficult circumstances, clearly.
And have been particularly active, especially over the last
Exactly.
few years. And in terms of your experience and representation in a number of organisations, national level and a regional level, do you see a greater role for national government in relation to the resilience, assurance, or civil contingencies generally?
I think that it's a system between there's about the relationship between central government and local government, central government and national voluntary sector partnerships such as ours, and then between us and the local level, and then the local level engagement. All of those, if that was a square of relationships we can strengthen all of them. And central government itself is made up of many departments who have different roles in an emergency. There's an opportunity to connect up the government departments better centrally, and then to have an expectation of them that they will engage in the kind of partnerships that enable us to work together to be better able to respond. And we're very committed, which is why we've created the Emergency Partnership, yes, to try to create the conditions in which that relationship can be built, can be deepened and developed in the interest of people we're all here to serve.
So, Adamson, I'm very grateful, and you'll be pleased to know that they're all the questions I have at this stage. What I'm going to do is, with the Chairman's permission, is ask perhaps for 5 minutes just to allow if there's any additional questions from those who are watching or within the room, and then we can bring you back in if that's okay.
Of course.
Yes, well, we do have a break at this stage, Mr. Adamson, because Council sometimes overlooks something that he ought to have put to you, or more likely that those outside the room who are following the proceedings may want to suggest questions that we should be asking you. So we'll break now. Is 5 minutes going to be enough, Mr. Keating?
I think it will be, and if I need more time, I'll ask for it.
All right, well, we'll come back at 4:30, and then we'll see if there are any more questions for you then.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to give the usher, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. 4:30, unless you tell us you need more time.
Thank you.
Would you ask Mr. Adamson to come back in, please? Yes, please sit down, yes.
Thank you, Mr.
Well,
Chairman.
we'll see if there are any more questions for you, shall we, Mr. Adams?
Okay.
All right, yes.
Just one question, actually,
you.
and if we could have a look at BRC 00066, which is the first report we've seen in the suite of reports, which was issued in 2018, and we're looking at the page already, at page 10. I'm very grateful. And you'll recall, just after the afternoon break, we were dealing with the principles in relation to having a human-focused, people-focused approach. And Principle 3, people should be supported in their local communities, and local communities should be empowered to respond. And it says this: local and diverse emergency response should be as local as possible. Our experience that local community organisations in emergencies, whether in the UK or internationally, have a critical role to play. And you've said to us already they're always first on the scene, and the British Red Cross is committed to supporting and nurturing that role, harnessing its national and global expertise. And this is the area which the question stems from. We already provide some training and advice to others in the sector to upskill them to play a greater role themselves. And it refers to providing free training for Islamic relief volunteers, and mentions how there's an intention to advise on how others can provide support and in following a crisis. And the question is this: is what else has the British Red Cross done or considers it will do to meet the diverse ethnic and cultural needs of those who are impacted by an incident? So in other words, how else would they support those voluntary organisations to meet the diverse ethnic and cultural needs?
So, as the British Red Cross, as an organisation, we put huge amounts of emphasis on our own approach to inclusion and diversity, and strengthening both the diversity of the organisation and the inclusivity of the approach to all our work. And so when we look at the way in which we responded, for example, to the COVID crisis, our specific aim was to focus on some of those groups, for example, that you highlighted earlier in the table from the report, that might otherwise get missed. The people who wouldn't have come forwards, the people who don't speak English, people who might have uncertain migration status, to ensure, for example, that they were coming forward to get vaccinated in that help, and that they were getting the practical help that they needed. So we're very systematic in using data and a vulnerability index that we developed, for example, for COVID, to target the postcodes where those situations were most likely to be, and that as one example. And in the context of the Voluntary and Community Sector Emergency Partnership, which we host and I co-chair, again, we are building an inclusive approach into the way in which we engage with the 150 organisations that are part of that partnership now, and if we all signed partnership agreements, which includes commitments to actually working in a needs-based way, and where we're using its networks of networks to connect then into local organisations who may have direct access to groups that would otherwise be forgotten, be they people from ethnic minorities, where they're particularly groups, for example, particularly targeted at diaspora communities who might otherwise get missed, or indeed it could be, it's not ethnicity, but around disability. And then we're doing community work. Then going back to the British Red Cross, we're also doing work specifically, for example, in some of the London boroughs to understand what the experience of people who are otherwise marginalised is in an emergency, and how we can connect. So there's a lot of effort going into creating the conditions, again, in which we can take a much more inclusive approach, and that's built into the way we think as the British Red Cross and the way we think as the Emergency Partnership. Think and act, I should say.
Yes. Ms. Adamson, thank you so much for that answer, and thank you very much for your evidence today. I have no further questions. It just remains for me, on behalf of the inquiry team, to thank you so much for attending today.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I must add my thanks on behalf of the panel, if I may, Mr. Adamson. It's been very interesting to hear what you have to tell us. Your evidence seems to have ranged far and wide over the course of the last few hours, so thank you very much indeed. We're very grateful to you for coming. And now, of course, you're free to go.
It's
Thank
my
you very
pleasure, and I wish you good luck with your incredibly important endeavours. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Keating, that is it for the day, but tomorrow there'll be another witness for us. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Millett is back tomorrow.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We'll break there and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please. 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you.